Welcome back to Dark Night Scare. In today's video, I am sharing 10 camping and hitchhiking true horror stories. Stay tuned, and please subscribe this channel and like this video. Thanks you all. Now let's start. It was mid-2018. I was 23 and had driven down to Vermont to see my family and hang out for a few weeks. While I was there, I also wanted to go camping because my parents' house was just outside the Appalachian Mountains. When I used to live with them, I'd go out all the time. But since I moved out, I hadn't had the chance to go camping or even hiking at all. There was one specific place that I'd had on my mind for a while. Just before I moved, I found a trail on a forum for people exploring abandoned structures, and I'd been wanting to check it out ever since. This trail supposedly led to an old lodge right in the middle of the forest. So, on a Monday morning, I drove out there. I parked on the side of the road, and the trail wasn't marked or anything. This was clearly just some rough path made by random people like me, wanting to explore the abandoned lodge. It was very overgrown though, so it looked like nobody had been down there in a while. The hike took just under 2 hours, and while it was mostly flat, it was a pretty difficult walk because of all the weeds and bushes growing into the path. But regardless, I made it. Now my plan was to camp inside the lodge, because why not? But I came prepared with a tent and everything in case it was completely destroyed or something. Good thing I did, because it was clear from the outside that it definitely wasn't safe to camp in. Most of the roof was gone, caving into itself, and the logs it was made of were full of thick mildew and mold. The door was wide open though, so I peeked my head inside and looked around. It smelled awful, and with all the decayed and destroyed parts everywhere, there wasn't much access to anything that I could look around. There was a door on the far end of the main hallway that looked intact, and I was trying to get to, but it was a bit too sketchy to get there, so I ended up just backing out. From there, I didn't have anything else planned, but with the sun already starting to set, I began looking around for a good place to set up camp. There really weren't many options, so I basically just walked 200 ft out from the lodge and cleared a small spot to put my tent. As the sun set, the darkness slowly covered the lodge in the distance until I could no longer see it, and all the forest sounds slowly turned into crickets in the warm crackle of the small campfire I built. I really wanted to stargaze, but the spot I was in had trees towering over me, blocking most of the view. Plus, it was partially cloudy, so I just sat there throwing sticks into the fire and thinking about whatever came to mind until I heard something. I don't really know how to describe it, but it was pretty loud. Maybe like wood bowing or bending. And even though I couldn't see the lodge anymore, the sound came from right where I knew the lodge was sitting in the dark. It only lasted a few seconds, but it sent chills through me. Maybe it was just the old wood bending and creaking in the wind, or maybe it was something else. I sat and listened for a while, like 30 minutes, without hearing anything else. It was only an hour or so into the night, but I knew if I didn't check on it now, I wouldn't be able to sleep later. So I figured I might as well go look around while it was still early into the night. I fueled up my campfire with some more sticks before leaving so I wouldn't have to rebuild it. Then I grabbed my small LED lamp and walked in the direction of the lodge. After only a minute of walking, the structure faintly showed up in the lights. It was as creepy as expected. I walked up to it cautiously, passing by a couple destroyed windows and holding the light up. Inside, it was extremely dark. Even with the light, it felt like I could barely see anything. When I got to the door, I was startled for a moment. It was closed. I'd been here less than 2 hours ago and left it wide open. Then I noticed something else. There were scratches like from nails or maybe a knife all along the front face of the door. I didn't notice them last time, so I wasn't sure if they were already there or had just happened and were maybe the sound I heard. I debated for a second whether or not I even wanted to try opening it or if I should just leave, but it was all for nothing because when I eventually decided to open it, I couldn't. It felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. I got really unsettled and didn't stay any longer. I backed away from the lodge and rushed back into the woods toward my campsite. However, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Aside from my lantern, there was no light coming from the forest. I started to hurry, hoping I was still going in the right direction. Luckily, I was. And a minute later, I made it back to my tent. A column of smoke filled the air above what was my campfire, as if someone had just abruptly put it out while it was still burning. I looked around, just standing there, holding my lantern up, barely able to see anything in the trees. Hello. Hello. Who's out there? Nobody responded. Starting to feel chills run through me again. I knew it was only a 2-hour hike back to where my car was, so I quickly decided to pack and head out. I took down my tent, and as I shoved the few remaining things into my backpack, I heard something nearby. I stopped for a second and held up my lantern, but still saw nothing. It sounded like someone was laughing. It was quiet, and not like someone laughing with their friends or anything. It was a single person softly laughing under their breath as they watched me from behind the trees in the dark like they were insane. I hurried up, leaving scraps behind and booking it to the trail with my crappy lantern. It was really hard to follow the path, but I did the best I could. Several times I stopped thinking I heard that soft laughing and worried I was being followed. But whoever it was stalking me out there, they were blending in with the dark perfectly, as I never once even caught sight of them. I got back to the road, getting in my car and driving away. I look back at that experience 7 years later as the single most disturbing and horrifying experience of my life. I don't think anyone can truly understand the feeling of helplessness. I felt being out there in the forest in the middle of nowhere at night and stalked by some insane person. Maybe they set up home in that abandoned lodge. I really don't know. But from everything I saw and experienced there, I don't think anyone should go back to find out. This was last year in the summer. I was out on a trail backpacking to a small camping spot with my dog Rocky. He's an Australian Shepherd, a medium-sized, really smart dog that comes with me everywhere I go, always loving running around and hiking through the woods. This place we were headed to was one I'd been to 3 or 4 times before. I loved it because it was isolated and never had anyone else, so Rocky could be free to run around off-leash and enjoy himself. The campsite was 8 hours down trail, so by the time we got there, it was just an hour or 2 before sunset. The campsite itself wasn't anything special or picturesque. It was just a small opening with nothing but trees all around. I found it calming and nice to hang out in, and safe for me to let Rocky roam around while still being able to keep an eye on him. I tossed my pack down and started to set everything up, which is when Rocky usually does his little patrol around the campsite. I saw him sniffing around and go a little ways into the woods while I continued to put our tent up, then unpack the rest of the things into the inside of the tent. About 15 minutes after arriving, Rocky came back to the campsite, but he was acting strange. His tail was down and he came right up to me, then turned and faced the direction he just came from, looking out into the woods. I almost never see him act like this unless there was a thunderstorm or something he was afraid of. I stood up and looked out where he came from, but saw nothing. I then checked him, making sure he didn't step on something and hurt himself. But he was completely fine, just anxious for some reason. It was pretty off-putting, especially from a smart and capable dog like Rocky was. I kept on the lookout as I finished setting up the camp and getting the campfire built. As I did, Rocky never left my side, not to explore or anything, just followed me around and kept his eyes on the woods. I will say, every time I looked back to check the woods, I felt a strange, uneasy sense, like I was being watched. I put it off as Rocky, just making me nervous since I didn't actually see anything, but it never really left my mind. I got the campfire going just as the sun fell past the top of the trees, covering the woods in a dark shadow. It was quiet, as it always was, but I didn't feel as calm as I usually did. I figured I wouldn't though because of Rocky's unusual behavior, but hoped tomorrow things would be more normal and we could go back to enjoying our time. For the night though, I just tended the fire and hung out with Rocky beside me, listening to the sounds of the forest. But then, just about an hour past sunset, Rocky suddenly perked his head up and froze. He stared anxiously out at the trees, ears up and tail between his legs. I looked out, but the darkness engulfed the area, making anything past 20 or 30 FT completely concealed. He started quietly whining, locking his gaze at the darkness behind the trees. Trusting him that something was wrong, I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out there. Not seeing much, I started to walk a little further in. Rocky followed closely, behind me. I didn't want to venture too far away from the campfire, but from the maybe 50 FT I walked out, I saw nothing in the woods. We went back and sat down. Even though I didn't see anything, I knew Rocky wouldn't be doing this for no reason. But it seemed most likely, and I guess I just hoped, that it was just an animal of some kind walking around the area. We weren't in bear territory, but I still carried bear spray on me, which would work on any animal, so I wasn't too worried for our safety. Rocky stayed on high alert all night, but didn't have any more sudden moments. And a couple hours later, we got in the tent and went to bed. I could tell Rocky was tired, probably from all the anxiety he was going through, and I was glad to see him close his eyes and fall asleep within 15 minutes. I did the same soon after. This might sound strange, but during that night, I remember having a dream about walking through the woods at night. I was alone. Rocky wasn't with me, and I was just walking through the trees, not on a path or anything. In the middle of that dream, I started to hear a high-pitched noise, over and over. It kept going until suddenly I shot awake. Rocky was nudging my face with his snout and whining in my ear, making that high-pitched noise I was hearing in my dream, immediately making me realize that he'd been trying to wake me for a while. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, feeling the nerves as I unzipped the tent and stepped out to look around. I turned on the flashlights, prepared to scan the area, but immediately when the light came on, it lit up a person right in front of me, like maybe 10 FT away from the tent. They had all black clothes on with a hoodie draping over half of their face, only showing their distressed beard. I quickly noticed a reflection coming from his hand, though, seeing the small blade of a pocket knife shining the light back at me. In that instant, I just froze up like my whole body went through a sudden shock. The man froze for a moment too, but then started to step forward again when Rocky began growling. Up until then, I hadn't even noticed that he'd come out of the tent and was standing right next to me. This made the man hesitate, giving me more time to collect myself and quickly reach into the tent for the bear spray. By the time I was back up, Rocky was aggressively barking and moving back and forth, putting himself between us. The man didn't take any more steps forward and just turned and ran into the woods. Thankfully, Rocky didn't chase after him. I started, taking everything down and packing as he kept his head up and circled around the campsite, guarding the whole area. Once packed, we started back down the trail. Honestly, even with my adrenaline still flowing through the entire hike back, I wasn't all that scared, knowing how well Rocky handled the situation. We made it back safely and got out of there. I did what I could to report the incident, but I think because of the location and everything, it wasn't really investigated. Anyway, I've gone on several camping trips since then, and Rocky was back to his normal self, happy and exploring the forests as usual. At least now I know that if he doesn't trust something, it's best to just get out of there. I was hiking to a fairly well-known overlook just outside of Glacier National Park in Montana. It definitely wasn't as great as any of the views within Glacier National Park, but it was just a normal trail with no rules or anything. Also, it was just before winter, which around here is off-season for most hiking and camping, which meant nobody would be out. I didn't mind the cold, so it was nice to have the trail and the overlook to myself. I finished hiking up there at just about 5:30, so it took nearly 6 hours, pretty much. There was this large grassy opening on top of the mountain, with a couple stone circles for making campfires and setting up camp around. And a little further up was a stone cliff that provided a view of the whole valley of mountains and forest. You could actually probably see Glacier National Park from there on a good clear day. Anyway, as expected, nobody else was at the campsite or at the overlook. I set up all my stuff by the stone circle closest to the overlook and made myself a quick dinner, then went to sit on the edge of the cliff to watch the sunset. I will say there was a bit of a drop below the overlook, which was kind of daunting at first, but the sun setting over the mountains made me completely forget about it. I sat there and watched it for a whole 30 minutes until it passed the horizon and got dark outside. Feeling good, I got up and turned to walk back to my campsite, but almost jumped back when I saw a man standing right behind me in the bushes near the edge of the forest. He was looking right at me. But what made it really creepy was as soon as I saw him, he just turned around and left right away. I couldn't see much of him since it was pretty dark out and he was in the bushes. But the man had no backpack on, so I thought he must have gotten to the campsite just after me and set up his stuff already. From where I was on the overlook, I could really only see my setup and none of the other parts of the campsite. But when I got closer, I still didn't see anything else. And the way the guy went into the forest was not in the direction of the campsite either. I thought it was really weird, but went on with my night. I put some dry sticks into the stone, circle and lit up a campfire, then set up my mini camping chair and sat by the fire. I didn't have much else to do that night. I honestly had no plan for this trip. I just wanted to come out here and relax all day and night and enjoy the forest. So, that's what I tried to do. Several hours went by. I think it was getting to be around 11 p.m. when I heard footsteps somewhere in front of me. Of course, I couldn't see anything, but it sounded eerily like human footsteps, one after the other, not too far away in the woods. Pretty soon after hearing them, I called out asking if someone was out there. The footsteps stopped for a moment, like they hesitated and then began walking again. But whatever it was out there, they didn't respond. Even though it sounded exactly like human footsteps without being able to see them and without them responding, I had to believe that it was just an animal, like maybe a deer or something. Because if it was a person, surely they'd respond. But also it made no sense for anyone to be walking around right now. Eventually, the steps faded out though. Another hour went by as I sat by the campfire. I didn't think the footsteps had me too nervous or scared, but they must have because I was still very awake, like definitely not able to sleep even though it was past midnight already. After a while, I knew I wasn't going to bed anytime soon, and I was getting bored, so I walked out to the overlook to see if maybe the stars were out. I left the fire going and got off, walking over to the cliff. The skies weren't too clear. However, the moon was shining down enough to cast a glowing light over the mountains and forest. The breeze was calming and quiet, moving across the valley. Stood there for maybe a minute before suddenly multiple sticks snapped behind me and a bush aggressively rustled. I spun around seeing that same man from earlier, but he didn't turn away this time. He moved through the bush and started quickly. Walking up to the overlook, I began asking what he was doing out here, but the guy just talked over me, holding this disturbing fake smile as he kept moving closer, saying random nonsense and keeping from answering any of my questions or even acknowledging anything that I said. The way he was coming at me was terrifying, and I tried to move to the side, but he was quick to get back in front of me. And suddenly, in the heat of the moment, I realized what was about to happen. He put his hands out and lunged at me, trying to push me over the ledge. Thank God I was prepared for it and had a stable footing, and I was a bit bigger than the guy, so I shoved him back and moved away from the cliff. As he stumbled, I tried to run back to the campsite, but he caught up pretty quick. This time, he didn't try to hide his intent. His face was horrifyingly angry and full of rage. I can't even imagine how lucky I was that this guy didn't have any form of weapon on him, because he definitely wouldn't have hesitated to use it. We wrangled around for maybe 30 seconds, but I kept getting the better of him. The guy was pretty skinny, like he hadn't eaten in a while, but he was just dead set on taking me down. After a few attempts though, he was finally beaten enough to run away. I didn't even try chasing or keeping them pinned. Way out here, it just wasn't worth the risk. I got everything together, put on my headlamp, and left the campsite. I made it about 2 hours back down the trail before my headlamp's batteries ran out, so I set up a mini camp in the woods and waited for sunrise, then finished the hike back. I put a report in and talked to a lot of people about my encounter, but everyone has different thoughts as to what the man was really doing out there. All I know is I could have lost my life that night had I been any less careful. It was back in 2016, but the details of that night remain vivid in my memory, as if it happened just yesterday. I often venture into the woods south of my town, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. This particular weekend, I felt a strong urge to get out there and spend some time alone. So, I quickly packed my backpack and drove down to my favorite trail. Honestly, I'm not even sure if it was a formally marked trail on any maps. No one ever seemed to hike or camp on it, so I really couldn't say if it was well known. I parked my car along the roadside near the trees, grabbed my bag, and hiked for 2 hours until I reached the end. This section of the woods wasn't mountainous or anything like that. It was very flat and densely packed with trees. It would be great for a laid-back 1 or 2 day camping trip, but beyond that, it could get a bit boring since it's not particularly challenging. The campsite itself wasn't much to look at. With several hours still left until sunset, I took my time setting everything up just right and starting the campfire. I relaxed, ate some trail mix, and simply enjoyed the warmth of the fire and the sound of birds chirping. As the sun began to lower in the sky, I added more sticks to the fire. I always found it fascinating how quickly the forest shifts from being so full of life to becoming almost instantly quiet once the sun goes down. I sat there, listening to the quietness, for only about 25 minutes after dark, when a strange sound broke the silence. It was music. It was coming from a distance, quite far away, and it sounded like some old classical piece. It almost sounded like an old record player playing. I stood up and looked in the direction the music was coming from. Was there another campsite nearby? Maybe it was just a group of people playing music, albeit very loudly. I stayed put at my campsite and listened for a while. It had to be at least 30 minutes. But what was so odd, and honestly a bit eerie, was that the song never changed. It was the same classical piece on repeat, filling the quiet woods. I'm usually not bothered if other campers are nearby, having a loud bonfire or whatever they want to do. But this felt different. Something wasn't right, and I didn't like it at all. After those 30 minutes, I decided to walk a bit closer just to see what was going on. I didn't want to seem like I was snooping, but I just wanted to make sure nothing weird was happening so I could actually sleep that night. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. I felt like I walked quite a distance, which made it even stranger that I could still hear the music from so far away. As I got closer and the music grew louder, a really creepy feeling started to set in. I could feel myself getting goosebumps and my heart was beating faster. It was then that I realized I'd only brought my flashlight. I should have brought my pocket knife or pepper spray, but I hadn't even thought about it. Eventually, I could tell I was getting very close. The music had to be coming from just 30 or 40 feet away, but I couldn't see anything. No bonfire, campfire, or any light source. And then I saw it. A large speaker propped up behind a tree. Nothing else was around. I shone my flashlight everywhere, but there were no signs of anyone. I walked up to the speaker. It looked like an old one from the early 2000s. Basically just a big box with an old LCD display and worn buttons. I found the power button and turned it off. Suddenly, the forest fell silent. The stark change was unsettling. Who could have done this? It almost felt like a trap. But even then, I made excuses, thinking maybe it was just another camper who left it there by accident. Nothing really made sense about it, though. I really didn't want to jump to the worst conclusion. I didn't stay any longer than necessary. I hurried back to my campsite, feeling relieved to see my campfire and return to what felt like the safety of my own camp. However, as minutes passed, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that something was still wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint what. This feeling intensified until I realized what was off. Things were missing. My matches for starting fires, my cooking utensils, and both my knife and pepper spray. They were all just gone. My body tensed up. Someone had definitely been there. I didn't hesitate for another second before packing up what little was left. As I did, I heard it again. The music, playing from the darkness of the woods. It sounded closer this time, definitely not coming from the direction of where I'd found the speaker before. I hurried, leaving the campsite and running back down toward the trail. As I got further away and the music started to fade, I began to feel a bit better. I was still freaked out, but I figured whoever was out there must have been near the speaker, which meant I was getting further away from them. I'd walked about 15 minutes down the path. Now, I was just walking through the quiet forest, far away from any music. And that's when I spotted something ahead, lying on the dirt trail. It was my stuff. The knife, pepper spray, utensils, all the things that had been missing. Someone had laid it all out perfectly lined up in the middle of the trail. What was the catch? Before I could even think about grabbing any of it, I heard a flurry of footsteps rushing behind me. I looked back, but saw nothing but darkness. So, I just sprinted away, leaving everything behind. I ran for what felt like 10 whole minutes, then walked quickly for the rest of the way. Thankfully, I finally got out of that forest and back to the road. I really can't explain what the hell I experienced that night. It feels like I barely escaped someone dangerous, almost like they were playing with their food. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I never plan to. I was camping alone on a trail about an hour north of Fairbanks, Alaska, in the area near the White Mountains. I'd already been set up at that spot with my tent for 2 days. It was just past noon, and since I'd made a campfire early, I was sitting around it, enjoying a meal when a man appeared. It startled me because I hadn't seen anyone or even much wildlife during the entire 2 days I'd been out there. I also hadn't heard him approaching or seen where he came from, whether it was the trail or just the surrounding wilderness. He looked like a typical camper though, with backpack gear and everything, and he seemed friendly enough. He simply asked if I knew where the cabin was. Although I'd never actually been to the cabin he mentioned, I did recognize what he was talking about. Many trails in that area have these public shelters, like small cabins, that hikers can use temporarily. They're usually not well maintained and operate on a first-come, first-served basis. During my 2 days at that campsite, I'd noticed a separate narrow path leading into the forest and assumed it led to one of those shelters. I told the man that, if there was a cabin out there, it was probably down that path. He thanked me and walked away. I didn't give it much more thought. I was just surprised to find someone else out there. I tended to the fire and relaxed for the rest of the day. This was the last night I planned to stay before heading back, so I just wanted to enjoy the scenery and the quiet. It was probably around 9 or 10 p.m., but around this time of year, up in Alaska, the sun doesn't fully set. It gets dark, but not pitch black like in most other places. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the woods, when, out of the trees, I saw someone walking toward me. As they got closer, I saw it was the same camper from earlier. I was rightfully confused about why he was there, but he explained immediately that he couldn't find the shelter. I mentioned maybe there wasn't one. I really didn't know, but the man corrected me, saying he never found the trail I'd pointed out and was hoping I'd show him the way. I found it strange that he'd been gone so long. If he hadn't found the trail, why was he coming back hours later? What had he been doing all that time, if not already staying in the shelter? I initially just tried to explain the trail's location again, but he seemed set on having me lead the way. He sort of made me feel guilty, saying he didn't have a tent and was relying on that shelter for the night. I felt bad, and even though I didn't really want to and found the whole situation a bit odd, I decided I'd just take him to the path. It wasn't far. Anyway, I slung my bag over my shoulders and started leading him there. I was certain I'd seen it, maybe a 10-minute walk into the forest. The entire walk there, the guy was mostly quiet. We both just walked without much talking. It felt like something had definitely shifted. 10 minutes later, though, I found the trail. It was exactly where I'd said it was. There was no way he could have missed it. And even weirder, I could actually see the shelter far down the path. Sure, it was a distance away, and trees blocked much of the view, but there was just no way he didn't see it from the directions I gave him. We walked a little closer, but the man didn't seem satisfied. I was expecting a thank you or something, but instead he said this wasn't the right cabin. I didn't understand what he meant. We kept walking, practically going right up to the cabin. It definitely didn't look like it was in good shape, but that's the risk with these kinds of public shelters. You really shouldn't rely on them. This one looked worse than most, with broken windows, moldy wood, and just an overall appearance of being deserted for years. As I was looking at it, I realized the man had gone quiet. I turned around. He had stopped walking, standing maybe 10 feet from me and holding out a knife. His face was stiff, and his eyes had a vacant stare. He told me in a flat, emotionless voice to go inside. I tried to ask what the hell he was doing, but he told me, again, without answering, to go inside the cabin. Adrenaline surged through me. I was angry that he'd taken advantage of my helpfulness, but also terrified knowing I was alone with him out there. I decided going into the cabin was probably the worst option. There was still some distance between us, so I dropped my bag and started running. Strangely, I didn't hear him chasing me. I looked back once I was further into the woods, and he was still just standing there, holding the knife and staring at me. After I got further into the forest, I found a good spot to hide and stayed there for a while, maybe 30 minutes. I hoped that was enough time for the guy to leave. Then, hidden by the darkness, I quietly moved through the trees back toward where the shelter was. The man was gone, or at least not standing outside the cabin like he had been. But my bag was gone too. I thought I'd been smart by dropping it, so I could run faster, but since he hadn't chased me, I felt maybe it had been a bad decision. My phone, wallet, keys, basically everything I had was in that bag. I quietly left the area and headed back toward my campsite. I could feel my heart beating faster as I got closer, just sensing that I still wasn't alone. Then I saw it. The bright glow of a campfire burning right in the middle of my campsite. I thought by then it would have burned out. I walked a little closer and saw my tent was still up, and as far as I could tell, the man was nowhere around. It was just the near, silent woods with the quiet, crackling fire. But then I saw my bag. It was sitting right in the middle of the campsite. Part of me really wanted to run up and grab it, but I also knew this was extremely suspicious. Why would he bring it back? He must have known I'd go back to the shelter for my bag, and if I didn't find it, I'd come back to the campsite. Even knowing all that, and that it had to be too good to be true, I was still about to run up and grab it when, all of a sudden, the man appeared. He casually walked out of the darkness behind the campfire, added some more sticks, and then sat down. I could hear him humming to himself too, like he was relaxed and just waiting. Realizing the danger, I turned around and found the main trail, hiking through the dark all the way back to the road. It took me hours to flag down a car willing to help. I then reported it to the police, and they went out to the forest with rangers the next morning, only to find nothing. All my stuff was gone, as if it had never been there. Even the stones from the campfire were moved and scattered into the forest, like they were trying to erase any sign of the campsite. The rangers also informed me that the cabin out there was discontinued, meaning no rangers were maintaining or servicing it anymore. That encounter left me feeling really uneasy for a long time. I couldn't trust anyone. I've gotten better over time, but I can't help but think about what might have happened. If I'd gone into that deserted shelter or tried to get my bag, I was likely one bad decision away from never leaving those woods. This happened just 2 weeks ago during a backpacking trip, my first one of the summer. As far as I knew, I was going on a very routine backpacking trip through a trail in northeastern Wyoming. The trail involved a 2-day hike there and a 2-day hike back the same way. I'd done many trails similar to this one, so I went into it thinking it would just be a typical few days. I parked at the empty trailhead and started walking. The first few hours went well. The route was quiet, and I felt like I was making good progress. I only had 3 miles left before I'd reach the first campsite, which I'd actually just be passing through and heading straight to the next one, 2 miles further, where I'd camp for the night. Feeling a bit hungry, I found a nice spot for a break, sat against a tree off the trail, and pulled out a snack. I was just taking a breather, wanting to eat quickly and then get back on the trail. But as I sat there, I happened to look up and see something rather creepy. A guy was standing in the woods off the other side of the trail, and he was staring at me. Not walking or anything, just staring. I had no idea how long he'd been there. Almost as soon as I made eye contact, he lifted his hand and did this really strange wave, like he was trying to show he was friendly. But the wave was almost robotic. It looked really strange and creepy, especially with him standing out there, staring at me. I decided to just stand up and continue down the trail. I was sure he wasn't up to anything, but I figured it was best to leave anyway. I didn't know why he was off the trail or what he was doing, and as long as I wasn't around him, I didn't care. Those next 3 miles were a bit tougher than I expected, taking nearly 2 hours before I reached the campsite. As I mentioned, this was the one I was just passing through, but since my break had been cut short earlier, I decided to use this as a chance to make a bigger meal and take a longer break before making the final trek to my actual camp for the night. I put my backpack down and took out my mini propane cooker to heat water and make my freeze-dried food. I got it boiling and poured it in, and as I was just waiting for it to cook, I heard footsteps coming down the trail. I looked over. It was the same man I'd seen in the woods. He had short black hair, a medium beard, was wearing a grey flannel shirt and blue jeans, and looked to be maybe in his mid-30s to early 40s. He looked like he was perhaps in his mid-30s to early 40s. As he walked up, I noticed he had a grin on his face, which I assume was meant to seem friendly, but it definitely didn't. He must have started walking here right after I did for him to get here so quickly. As he approached, he said hello and started small talk, asking about the hike and such. I gave short answers, hoping he'd continue on the trail. But my heart sank when he came right up next to me and sat down. He was acting far too friendly, to the point where it felt like he was being aggressively friendly, like there was no way he was genuine. He was really starting to creep me out. I tried to eat my meal quickly, but the guy kept asking me questions about it. At one point, he was jokingly mocking me for eating what he called a homeless meal and said I needed better nutrition. He tried handing me an opened protein bar. I kid you not, he pulled it out of his backpack and the wrapper was already open, but no bites had been taken out of it. I turned it down, obviously, but he was being really pushy about it. Eventually, he gave up though, saying that he was going to be staying the night at this campsite too, so he'd give it to me later if I was hungry. Hearing that was an immediate relief. He was staying at this campsite. All I had to do was get out of there. I finished eating, then said a friend was waiting for me at the next campsite, so I had to go. The guy kept his smile, but I could tell there was nothing behind it. His whole face was expressionless. He was just holding this fake smile, and it was really creepy. I walked away, checking back a few times to make sure he didn't follow. I don't know what was up with that guy. Maybe he was just some harmless person wanting to chat. But my gut told me to get away, so that's what I did. A couple of hours later, I reached my camp for the night. The sun was already setting, so it was getting pretty dark, and although I was tired, something told me to wait to set up my tent or unpack anything until later, just in case I needed to make a quick escape. Goodness I did, because not 10 minutes later, I heard those same footsteps crunching on the leaves down the trail. A moment later, the man showed up, still holding that creepy grin. It definitely wasn't smart of me, but immediately upon seeing him, I got really angry. I felt like I'd done everything to get away from this guy, and now I was pissed. He said he was staying at the other camp, so what the hell was he doing here? Stupidly, I straight up asked if he was following me, making it clear by my tone that I was serious. But the guy just gave a joking laugh and said, "Yeah, I'm following you," like he was being sarcastic. He still had that creepy smile on his face. He started asking if I was hungry after all that walking, but I quickly grabbed my bag and ignored him. I walked back the way I came, again, not seeing him immediately follow, but I knew better than to trust that. I passed the previous camp, exhausted, but kept going until I couldn't anymore. I was maybe a mile past the first camp. I moved off the trail. Honestly, I'm not sure how far off I even went, probably 200 to 300 feet. Then I discreetly set up my tent. I left almost everything still in my backpack just in case. Then I laid down and tried to sleep. Despite the whole disturbing situation, I was so exhausted that I fell asleep surprisingly quickly. But in the middle of the night, my eyes shot open. I could hear footsteps crunching on the leaves coming from the direction of the trail. It had to be him again, walking through the woods in the middle of the night, looking for me. The footsteps got closer, but then they started to fade out, moving further down the trail. He didn't see me. I waited until sunrise, then hurried back to my car. Thankfully, I never ran into him again. I don't know where he went after that. Honestly, I think I was disturbingly close to something really horrifying happening. My encounter with that strange man could have been really bad. I think he had some pretty bad intentions, especially the more I think about the protein bar he tried to give me and the whole situation. It still makes me sick to think about it. Several years ago, my brother Jason and I moved to Colorado. We both desired to live near the mountains, but neither could afford it independently. Consequently, we shared the rent on a town home in the Denver suburbs. This arrangement was ideal, because we were merely 10 to 15 minutes from a vast mountain range. However, I should note that the nearby hiking and camping trails are quite popular. Due to their accessibility, it's difficult to find solitude almost any time of year. For this reason, my brother and I decided to organize a 3-day backpacking excursion, aiming to escape the crowds and hopefully find some peace and quiet. I entrusted him with planning the route, and a couple of weeks later, we drove to the trailhead. Only one other vehicle was parked there upon our arrival. An old, dusty SUV that looked like it had endured a rough journey. Assuming it was likely, the only other person hiking this route, we entered the experience with optimism. The first day's backpacking involved an 8-mile hike. Most of the terrain was flat until the final few miles, where we began ascending a mountainside. It was quite tiring, but Jason assured us the campsite would be worth it, and indeed, he wasn't lying. About 3/4 of the way up the mountain, we found a small flat area right on the cliff's side, offering a view of the entire valley. It was breathtaking, especially as the sun began to set. After taking in the view, we started pitching our tents and then gathered sticks and stones to build a fire pit. Once the fire was burning, we sat down and simply talked. I have no idea how long we conversed for, perhaps 2 hours or more. Then, we both heard something from the trail. We instantly fell silent, listening as footsteps started approaching the trail and moving toward our campsite. A minute later, a man emerged from the darkness and into the distant light emanating from our fire. He wasn't wearing a headlamp, which every hiker and camper knows is an absolute necessity when there's even the possibility of being out in the dark. As he walked closer, I believe both Jason and I sensed something was amiss. He had a grin on his face as he neared the campfire. "Hey, did you need something?" Jason asked, standing up. The man glanced at Jason, then at me, maintaining his grin as he started to explain. He claimed to be a park ranger and stated he had been following our trail for a while. He said this section had been closed for the season and we were not permitted to be there. However, something felt very strange, as we knew the park was open and we had even obtained permits from the state the day before for camping there. We also knew that park rangers wouldn't typically be out on a remote mountain trail in the middle of the night. But if he wasn't who he claimed to be, then what was he doing out here? I could sense Jason's mind racing too, as we both stared at the man and began asking questions, but he quickly cut us off. "You both need to leave with me right now," he demanded. "Pack up and follow me. I'll lead you guys back to the trailhead." We stood there in silence for a moment, absorbing his words and realizing something was seriously wrong. The man remained by the fire, still wearing that same grin on his face. "No, we're staying here," Jason stated firmly. The man looked at him again, then at me, keeping that same eerie grin, and simply turned around and walked away. Terrified, we didn't speak for several minutes, just listening intently to ensure he didn't return. Then, we grabbed more dry sticks and rekindled the fire. Neither of us slept, We stayed up the entire night. Sometimes we thought we heard footsteps again, but we never saw the man once. When the sun rose, we packed our belongings and left, cutting our trip short and retracing the trail back to our car. When we arrived back at the trailhead, that same dusty SUV was still there, which made us both wonder if that other hiker had encountered the same man as us and what had happened to them. We notified the police, but ultimately it led to nothing. There's no doubt the man was lying about being a park ranger, but the fact that he tried to lead us out into the woods in the middle of the night strongly suggests he was likely up to something horrible. What exactly that was, we don't know, but it seems the other hiker may have been unfortunate enough to find out. I used to frequently go camping with some buddies from college, but after we graduated, we never seemed to find the time anymore. With everyone's schedules being so different, I ended up going out on my own. There was a particular campground we used to frequent, so I decided to play it safe and go to that same spot. It was somewhat remote and not the easiest place to reach, which was part of the reason I liked it. Nobody else would typically be there because there were many more convenient camping options nearby. Since I knew the route, I arrived without any trouble and set up all my gear. Shortly after, however, a man showed up. He looked like any other hiker, but he only had a small backpack, indicating he definitely didn't have a tent or camping gear. The only thing that made me question why he was there was that this wasn't a particularly scenic spot, just a nice place to camp. If you weren't camping, there would be no reason to hike all the way out here. At the time, I didn't think too much about it because the man seemed normal enough. Maybe he just wanted a quiet space to relax for a bit. I stayed near my tent, and the man remained on the other side of the campground. Around 6 p.m., I left my tent area to cook my dinner, and it was around then that I saw the man finally leave. I thought it was a bit late for him to be heading back because it would be completely dark in less than an hour, and the hike was probably around 3 hours long. Other than that, I was just happy to finally be alone. I boiled water using my mini stove and prepared one of my freeze-dried meals. Then, I returned near my tent and sat down. The sun had nearly set, so I took out a small lantern and hung it on the side of the tent. As I stayed outside, taking in the atmosphere, it suddenly occurred to me that I was completely alone out there. Usually, we'd all gather around a campfire and talk. But by myself, I didn't really have anything to do. After a while, I turned off the lantern and went inside my tent, lying down and preparing to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps nearby. When I opened my eyes, it was pitch black, and I had no idea how long I'd been asleep. But the footsteps grew closer and closer until they stopped on the other end of the campground. After a few seconds, I felt around for my lantern, turned it on, and unzipped the tent to look out. About 20 feet from my tent, there was the silhouette of a man standing right where I'd seen the other guy standing earlier. From what I could discern, it was likely the same person. They were just standing there, not doing anything. It was late enough into the night that this was immediately disturbing, regardless of the context, and having turned on my lantern, he definitely saw me. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out to him. I waited a couple of seconds, but he showed no signs of acknowledging me. I couldn't even tell which direction he was facing. He was either facing away or directly at me, and I don't even know which prospect was more disturbing. I reached for my pocket knife from my backpack, then did the only thing I could do, sit there and wait. The most increasingly uneasy 15 minutes of my life passed as I watched this man standing there, barely moving. Then he suddenly turned and walked off in the same direction he had gone before. As I watched his figure turn, I could see that he had been facing me the entire time he was there. He was just staring at me. I felt chills run through me as the man's footsteps got quieter and quieter, fading out in the distance. I didn't know what else to do other than stay awake in case he returned, and as far as I know, he never did. I left in the morning and got back safely, but since then, I haven't gone out camping. I don't know what that man was doing, but there's No scenario in which that wasn't extremely disturbing. Maybe I scared him off by waking up and watching him to make sure he didn't do anything, but that just terrifies me to think about, if I hadn't woken up that night. I was out camping in the backcountry near where I lived one night. I'm not much of a hiker, so I never take trails more than a mile or two. This particular one was just over a mile from the campsite back to the trailhead where my car was parked. I'd been spending the weekend there, camping by the lake, and was planning on staying for another 2 nights. On the 3rd day, I spent the morning hiking back to my truck, grabbing my fishing rod and some spare food, then hiking back to the camp. I thought I'd try my luck fishing while I had the time. When I got back to the camp, however, there was another tent set up. It was farther down on the edge of the lake, and initially, I didn't see anyone by it. I didn't care at first, but then it occurred to me that I hadn't seen anyone on the only trail leading to this part of the lake. Then again, there could have been some other path I just didn't know about. Whatever the case, I set up my rod and started fishing. Every 20 minutes or so, I'd glance over at the tent on the side of the lake. But at no point during the 3 hours I was out there did I see anyone. As the sun began to lower, I packed up my rod and returned to my tent. I ate, gathered some sticks for the campfire, and waited for it to get a little darker before lighting it up. As soon as I did, I saw someone's shadow move in the forest ahead of me. They were just far enough away for the light not to reach them, so after that quick glimpse, all I could see was total darkness. I assumed it was the person with the tent down by the lake, probably gathering sticks for a fire. It was weird that just as I lit up my campfire, they were right outside my camp, but I chose not to overthink it. I leaned back in my chair and relaxed, looking at the fire, the sky, and the lake. It was so calming, I almost wanted to fall asleep in the chair, but just a half hour later, I looked past the fire and saw several figures emerging from the forest. Once they were closer, I counted 4 men all coming right up to my campsite. A lot was going through my head, but I tried to suppress any nervous feelings and hoped it was just a nearby camping group in need of help or something. When they came into the light, I could see they were all in their 30s or 40s and had stern faces. Once they were just a few feet away and still advancing, I got up from my chair and nervously began asking what they needed. None of them responded, only continuing to walk closer. 2 of them went behind me, heading straight for my tent, while the other 2 pushed me aside. There was no doubt what was happening now, but I knew fighting back would only make things worse. I watched the 2 men start rummaging through my belongings as the other 2 kept pushing me further away. I tried saying anything I could, but the men had an emptiness in their eyes that showed they did not care at all. I was telling myself in my head to just stay calm and let them take what they wanted. But the 2 men kept pushing and dragging me further and further out, away from the campsite and away from the light. After a minute, I could barely see where we were going and could only hear our footsteps in the silent forest. Then we stopped. I turned and faced them. And as we stood in the darkness between the trees, all my fears hit me at once. One of them reached for something, and I instantly took off running. All I could hear were my footsteps pounding against the leaves and grass as I got further out. I still had a general sense of direction, so I tried to get back to the trail and my truck. From what I could tell, nobody followed me. I reported the incident to the police, but in the end, almost all my stuff was stolen, and there was no trace left to help figure out who they were or what they were dragging me out into the forest to do. What they were planning is probably obvious, so I think I was incredibly lucky to have made it out with my life. It was back in 2016, but the details of that night remain vivid in my memory, as if it happened just yesterday. I often venture into the woods south of my town, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. This particular weekend, I felt a strong urge to get out there and spend some time alone. So, I quickly packed my backpack and drove down to my favorite trail. Honestly, I'm not even sure if it was a formally marked trail on any maps. No one, ever seemed to hike or camp on it, so I really couldn't say if it was well known. I parked my car along the roadside near the trees, grabbed my bag, and hiked for 2 hours until I reached the end. This section of the woods wasn't mountainous or anything like that. It was very flat and densely packed with trees. It would be great for a laid-back 1 or 2 day camping trip. But beyond that, it could get a bit boring since it's not particularly challenging. The campsite itself wasn't much to look at. With several hours still left until sunset, I took my time setting everything up just right and starting the campfire. I relaxed, ate some trail mix, and simply enjoyed the warmth of the fire and the sound of birds chirping. As the sun began to lower in the sky, I added more sticks to the fire. I always found it fascinating how quickly the forest shifts from being so full of life to becoming almost instantly quiet once the sun goes down. I sat there, listening to the quietness, for only about 25 minutes after dark, when a strange sound broke the silence. It was music. It was coming from a distance, quite far away, and it sounded like some old classical piece. It almost sounded like an old record player playing. I stood up and looked in the direction the music was coming from. Was there another campsite nearby? Maybe it was just a group of people playing music, albeit very loudly. I stayed put at my campsite and listened for a while. It had to be at least 30 minutes. But what was so odd and honestly a bit eerie was that the song never changed. It was the same classical piece on repeat, filling the quiet woods. I'm usually not bothered if other campers are nearby, having a loud bonfire or whatever they want to do. But this felt different. Something wasn't right, and I didn't like it at all. After those 30 minutes, I decided to walk a bit closer just to see what was going on. I didn't want to seem like I was snooping, but I just wanted to make sure nothing weird was happening so I could actually sleep that night. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. I felt like I walked quite a distance, which made it even stranger that I could still hear the music from so far away. As I got closer and the music grew louder, a really creepy feeling started to set in. I could feel myself getting goosebumps, and my heart was beating faster. It was then that I realized I'd only brought my flashlight. I should have brought my pocket knife or pepper spray, but I hadn't even thought about it. Eventually, I could tell I was getting very close. The music had to be coming from just 30 or 40 feet away, but I couldn't see anything. No bonfire, campfire, or any light source. And then I saw it. A large speaker propped up behind a tree. Nothing else was around. I shone my flashlight everywhere, but there were no signs of anyone. I walked up to the speaker. It looked like an old one from the early 2000s, basically just a big box with an old LCD display and worn buttons. I found the power button and turned it off. Suddenly, the forest fell silent. The stark change was unsettling. Who could have done this? It almost felt like a trap. But even then, I made excuses, thinking maybe it was just another camper who left it there by accident. Nothing really made sense about it, though. I really didn't want to jump to the worst conclusion. I didn't stay any longer than necessary. I hurried back to my campsite, feeling relieved to see my campfire and returned to what felt like the safety of my own camp. However, as minutes passed, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that something was still wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint what. This feeling intensified until I realized what was off. Things were missing. My matches for starting fires, my cooking utensils, and both my knife and pepper spray, they were all just gone. My body tensed up. Someone had definitely been there. I didn't hesitate for another second before packing up what little was left. As I did, I heard it again. The music, playing from the darkness of the woods. It sounded closer this time, definitely not coming from the direction of where I'd found the speaker before. I hurried, leaving the campsite and running back down toward the trail. As I got further away and the music started to fade, I began to feel a bit better. I was still freaked out, but I figured whoever was out there must have been near the speaker, which meant I was getting further away from them. I'd walked about 15 minutes down the path. Now I was just walking through the quiet forest, far away from any music, and that's when I spotted something ahead, lying on the dirt trail. It was my stuff. The knife, pepper spray, utensils, all the things that had been missing. Someone had laid it all out perfectly lined up in the middle of the trail. What was the catch? Before I could even think about grabbing any of it, I heard a flurry of footsteps rushing behind me. I looked back, but saw nothing but darkness. So, I just sprinted away, leaving everything behind. I ran for what felt like 10 whole minutes, then jogged, walked quickly for the rest of the way. Thankfully, I finally got out of that forest and back to the road. I really can't explain what this hell I experienced that night. It feels like I barely escaped someone dangerous, almost like they were playing with their food. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I never plan to.